Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I have good news and bad news for you, and I would like to start with the very good news first, because the HDR black level floor in Alan Wake 2 is spot on. But what does it mean? It means that we already ticked 1 out of 2 checkboxes for having a great HDR implementation. And don't get me wrong, to have a really good HDR implementation in a game or movie, we of course need more than just 2 checkboxes, but in my opinion we have two major qualities what we need to have to actually start talking about a good HDR implementation. And the headline for this is contrast, and contrast includes shadow details, very good shadow details, and of course specular highlights, very bright specular highlights. And we established already that in regards of the HDR black level floor there is nothing to complain about in Alan Wake 2. If there would be something to complain, then it would be around HDR black level crush, because in certain locations or scenarios I found that we're missing some very fine details. So we have probably some minor HDR black level crush, but to be very honest, I rather have some minor HDR black level crush than an HDR black level floor like in Starfield. The second important quality for a good HDR implementation is specular highlights or brightness, maximum peak brightness. And here we're running into an issue because I'm not quite happy about the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights in Alan Wake 2. And before we now talking about HDR in more detail, let's talk about the main difference what I found in regards of HDR between the PC version and the console version. With ray tracing disabled on the PC, the game looks very similar in regards of shadow details or how shadows or darker areas are getting displayed on the screen. They're looking very similar to the console version, but as soon you enable ray tracing, it changes everything. So first of all, what we need to understand is that Alan Wake 2 supports the HDR system level calibration on the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series and PC Windows 11. That means you must, and this is a crucial thing, you must set up the HDR system level calibration in the correct way. Otherwise, you have not a very good experience when it comes to HDR, because the game relies on this information. But even I have set up the HDR system level calibration in the correct way, and you can verify this in the game because the game reads back the value. But even then, I found that some specular highlights are not very specular. And it appears to me that we have some sort of creator's intent in regards of these specular highlights in Alan Wake 2, because some of these specular highlights are very powerful and very, very bright, but others are just a little bit dull and powerless, I would almost say. So it appears to me that this is the case, and I have to admit that I found situations where I analyzed a very low maximum peak brightness, but the overall impression from the picture was actually not too bad. So what I like to say is that we don't need all the time maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. Sometimes less is even more. So let's have a quick look on the internal HDR settings what we have in the game, and we have actually 2 settings. One is called game brightness setting and the other one is the user interface brightness. And as always, the user interface brightness is really just for the user interface, for the HUD or some symbols on the screen, and you can change this as you like it. But now when we're talking about the game brightness setting, it is getting a little bit more interesting, because the game brightness setting is not just changing the average picture brightness or is helping us to lift the black level floor slightly to have a little bit more shadow details. No, it's also changing or affecting the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And this is actually very helpful, because I mentioned already that I'm not very happy about the specular highlights, about the maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. And by increasing the game brightness setting, we can help the game to pop a little bit more. But as always, we need to be careful that we're not increasing this value too much, because we're lifting the whole gamma in the game, which is in my opinion not a big problem, because we still yeah, even we setting the game brightness to 100, we still have a perfect HDR black level floor. This is very, very important, but the game in general gets just much brighter. And when you have, let's say, a location scenario where you have a lot of fog or mist, or it is actually, or it looks already a little bit washed out by creators' intent, then when you increase the brightness, you lift everything up and it looks even more washed out. So this is to consider. But what I found is increasing the level or the setting to 75 is actually a good start, especially when you use HDRH. I actually can go even a little bit higher. But as always, this is a personal reference, and I found 75 to 100 is actually a good start. Another quality of a good HDR implementation would be the use of HDR Colors, DCI-P3 or BT2020. And here we have some sort, very minor use of the HDR color space. And we need to understand one thing. It is not necessary or mandatory to use all the time the HDR color space, because many colors or most of the colors are working just perfectly with the SDR color range, which you can see most of the time in HDR games or even in HDR movies. But of course, we like to use the HDR color space because we spend a lot of money for our HDR TVs. Earlier in the video I mentioned already that I recommend to use HDRH because with adjusted game brightness settings it is actually doing a great job. But as always, it is up to you. If you like to use dynamic tone mapping on rather than HDRH, that's your choice. But I would not recommend it. The reason is quite simple. We have specular highlights in this game which are not reaching the maximum peak brightness capabilities of our TV. With using the HDRH settings on our TV and in combination with adjusting the game brightness setting to, let's say, 75, we increasing the maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. And not just like that, we getting actually more HDR brightness in general with just enabling dynamic tone mapping on the TV and not increasing the game brightness in the game. This is not the case. That means we have actually a lower quality of HDR. On the Xbox Series S and X you can play this game in Dolby Vision, but let me tell you one thing, there is no native Dolby Vision support. That means the game will look very similar to HDRH. My recommendation is still, even on the Xbox, use HDRH. So we talked a lot about the HDR black level floor, which is implemented in the game. But what about the HDR black level raise when we activating HDR and when we activating VRR, which I strongly recommend because the PlayStation 5 and also the Xbox Series version are not running with perfect 60 FPS the whole time. So enabling VRR on the console will help to actually get you a much better experience. But the problem is, as in many other games, as soon you enable VRR, you have additional black level raise. And to mitigate this HDR black level raise or VRR black level raise, there's nothing what we can do inside the game, because if we would like to change some settings in the game, we would actually crush shadow details. What we need to do is we need to use the fine-tune dark area settings on our LG OLED TV or the shadow detail setting on our Samsung TV. And if you like to use HDRH in this game, then my recommendation is for the fine-tune dark area setting -4. And if you like to use dynamic tone mapping on, which again I would strongly not to recommend to use, then go with -8, because this makes sure that we don't have any additional HDR black level raise. And on my S95C I found that setting the shadow details to -2, maximum -3 will help to mitigate the VRR black level raise. But we need to be very careful with this setting because it is not as good as the LG OLED fine-tune dark area setting. The shadow detail setting on the Samsung S95C or similar TVs is changing a lot more than just the very low end from the gamma curve as the FTDA settings are doing. That's why be very careful when you change this. Rather have it set to 0 than losing fine details in shadows. Okay, my friends, so what is my summary now in regards of HDR in Alan Wake 2? And I like it. It's not one of the best HDR implementations when we're talking about specular highlights, but in regards of the HDR black level floor, they did a great job. That's exactly how we like it, or how it should be in every HDR game. Because what we learned is that the HDR black level floor is one of the most important qualities in a good HDR implementation, because I just like to remember you on Starfield. It is still not fixed, by the way, officially not fixed. We still have this very washed out look which destroys the whole picture. Here, Alan Wake 2 is actually a very good reference when we're talking about HDR black level floor implementation. And the only thing I can complain about in this game in regards to HDR is the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights, but this is already complaining on a higher level. Especially with HDRG, the game just looks a little bit too dark, and we need to increase the brightness setting, unfortunately a lot, to get a nice looking picture out with HDRG enabled. So we have seen games like Spider-Man 2 where the HDR implementation in combination with HDRG enabled is just spot on. Really, really great, and my reference alongside games like Ratchet & Clank. But in this case, something is just a little bit missing. It's not a big deal breaker because we have settings where we can change it, but it would be of course better if this wouldn't be necessary, or not in the case as we like or as we have to do it. But in general, the HDR implementation in Alan Wake 2 is on a high level, on a great level. It's not a masterpiece like Spider-Man, Ratchet & Clank, or maybe Forza on the Xbox, but it is very, very good, and it makes actually really fun to look at the picture because the graphic, especially the PC version, is really outstanding in my opinion, especially with ray tracing enabled and path tracing. And by the way, I'm working on a performance video, and I hope I can finish this at some point. But there is quite of a, spoiler alert, there is quite of a difference between the console version and a high-end PC, which of course should be expected like that. Anyway, in regards of HDR, I am very happy, and I need to continue playing this game because the story gameplay in this game is also very good.